Hello, and welcome to another episode of Exposing Postmedia Propaganda. I'm your host, David J.W. Now, once again, I'm a little bit behind the eight ball. The article that I'm going to be talking about today came out a few months ago. Once again, it's by Jamie Sarkonak. You know, it's really tough to keep up with postmedia propaganda. I mean, they publish it every single day. And this was a piece that I saw a while ago and I did the reading for. And it's taken me a little while to sit here and do the intro. It's been a busy summer, let's say. But this is a really important issue and I really didn't want to just leave it by the wayside. So here we are. Now, once again, we're focusing on the musings of Edmonton-based hack writer Jamie Sarkonak. I don't know what she studied in school. There's very little information about her online. But she's badly in need of some re-education when it comes to the realities of institutional racism in Canada's so-called justice system. The police and courts are racist as hell, and let's hear more about that. A couple months ago, Postmedia published an op-ed by Sarkonak in which she denies systematic anti-Indigenous racism in the courts. Her writing would qualify as comically ignorant if it weren't so full of mischaracterizations and the denialism we've come to expect from avowed white supremacists, not national affairs columnists working for the largest media company in Canada. As usual, Sarkonak begins her opinion piece with avowed contempt for the subject matter and explicit denials of reality. She begins, "The Government of Canada's Indigenous Justice Strategy, released in March, promises to build a parallel criminal justice system for Indigenous people while reforming the rest of Canadian law to address systematic discrimination. It's hardly necessary considering how Indigenous people might even fare better in the criminal justice system than their white counterparts." Jamie, did you speak to any Indigenous people? Have you ever met an Indigenous person? I mean, it's incredible the stuff you write. This first paragraph is breathtaking in its inversion of reality. According to the Correctional Service of Canada, half of all federal female prisoners are Indigenous. Half. And yet Indigenous people, specifically Indigenous women, make up much less than like 4% of the population. I think Indigenous people are 4% of the population. So Indigenous women make up half of federal imprisoned people. Federally imprisoned people. Half of them are Indigenous women. In some rural jails, especially in places like Manitoba or Alberta, where Jamie Sarkonak is from, Indigenous people represent up to 80% of the people in jails. Jamie, you didn't do any research. But propagandists like Jamie Sarkonak are not troubled by facts, right? She goes on to claim the report made additional findings. One, that Indigenous people were 100% more likely than white people to have their charges stayed. And white accused were 20% more likely to have their charges withdrawn, which was about the same effect as a stay. This isn't correct. Stayed charges can be relitigated by the Crown at any time. So that means that Indigenous people who have their charges stayed continue to live with the threat of those charges being reinstated at any time. And by comparison, those white people who get their charges withdrawn can rest easy. They're withdrawn, they're done, right? So Jamie, you have no idea what you're talking about. Another finding listed in Sarkonak's op-ed, here we go, was in the area of sentencing. Among those found guilty, Indigenous offenders were more likely to receive a jail sentence, an effect that was particularly pronounced among first-time offenders. Yeah, there you go. However, among all offenders sentenced to custody, Indigenous people were more likely to receive short sentences, while white offenders were more likely to receive medium-term or long-term sentences. Now, Sarkonak ignores the obvious here, which is that white offenders might be more likely to have actually committed offenses for which they deserve to receive medium and long-term sentences, rather than Indigenous people who are more likely to be arrested and charged for minor offenses. Minor offenses, Jamie, such as public intoxication, petty theft, or the minor issues which white people are much less likely to get caught, much less likely to get arrested, much less likely to be taken to court and convicted, obviously. So Sarkonak goes on. As for house arrest, Indigenous offenders were 25 to 35% more likely to receive it as a sentence, depending on the year, in relation to white offenders. Probation and fines, on the other hand, were more prevalently given to white offenders. Finally, white offenders were more likely to be acquitted. So, and so, Jamie, you're saying that Indigenous people fare better in the system? It's amazing. Her next lines are instructive of her overall attitude and what makes her such a devastating disinformation propagandist. Now, hear me out. She goes to say, interestingly, much of the author's analysis attributed their findings to the existence of systematic racism against Indigenous people. The fact that Indigenous people had more prior convictions was blamed on society. Quote, criminal history reflects the influence of various factors in addition to prior actions, including socioeconomic marginalization, racism, and systematic discrimination, unquote. We're back to Jamie here. The higher likelihood of Indigenous people to breach court order conditions was blamed on historical systematic discrimination and, quote, cultural differences and ambivalence towards the Western justice system, unquote. So for Sarkonak, discrepancies between how Indigenous and white people are treated come down to cultural differences, not systematic racism and colonization. She claims that, overall, the study showed that the creeping evil of systematic discrimination that has allegedly corrupted the justice system, and really all of Canada, isn't actually there. Yes, it's true that Indigenous people are overrepresented in the criminal justice system, but that's just a function of that population charged with more crimes. Why are they charged with more crimes? Accounting for offense severity, they're guilty at just the same rate as the privileged whites. And on a number of metrics, they receive gentler outcomes as well. Stayed charges, not withdrawal charges. Shorter prison terms, house arrest. So you see, it's not racism. It's not settler colonial white supremacy, no. It's not racist cops. It's not Crown prosecutors that hate Indigenous people. The problem is Indigenous people in the justice system is that they just commit so much more crime than white people, is what Jamie wants us to believe. Indigenous people are criminals. It's culturally, they just commit crimes, right? This is what Jamie's actually saying in this article. Smells like racist revisionism to me. But let's continue. Sarkonak goes on to say, then there's the fact that white offenders were given more long-term sentences and were less likely to get house arrest. That tracks with the aggressive nudging the federal government has been giving the courts regarding Indigenous offenders. Lower jail sentences and more house arrest. The Federal Prosecution Desk Book even tells Crown prosecutors to seek lighter sentences for Indigenous offenders. Heck, it's the law, she says. The Supreme Court has required judges to consider race-based discounts for Indigenous people since the 1999 decision of R versus Gladue. I'm so glad, Jamie, you brought this up. Because here it's important to note that the Gladue decision and subsequent changes to the justice system have actually made things worse for Indigenous people here in Canada. According to the Aboriginal People's Television Network, Jamie, listen, you didn't obviously watch this, you haven't done any research. So this is the APTN says, the application of what are called Gladue principles has largely failed in Canada because of several factors, including a disorganized Gladue process, limited resources for rehabilitation, and Gladue workers, the rise of Indigenous identity fraud, and the lack of support for victims, families, and communities, according to a report released by the Yellowhead Institute. We're going to quote the report here. The uneven application of Gladue, lack of related infrastructure, and near absent support for community justice initiatives has resulted in the process that now reproduces a myriad of harms it was initially designed to prevent. The report, 25 years since Gladue, released in July 2024, said, okay? We are now producing a myriad of harms that Gladue was initially designed to prevent. So, Jamie Sarkonak talks about, that it's the law. The Supreme Court has required judges to consider race-based discounts since Gladue in 1999. But here we are. Surprise, surprise, Gladue is actually having the opposite effect as what it was intended. Hayden King, one of the report's co-authors, said, and we're going back to the APTN reporting here, said neither Indigenous perpetrators nor victims of crimes are being well served by the way Gladue is currently being applied. Here's a direct quote. I mean, people are really hurt by their paths through the criminal justice system and the lack of justice that communities and families are receiving in the system. I think that's that's on the one hand, and on the other, it's the fact that we continue to see these incredibly disproportionate rates of incarceration among Indigenous peoples. But of course, Jamie Sarkonak wants us to believe that Indigenous people and white people are equal in front of blind justice. But honestly, who actually believes that's the case? You'd have to be an ignorant white supremacist to believe that Indigenous people and white people are treated equally. And even then, you wouldn't be ignorant. You'd just be lying. Yeah, you'd have to be born yesterday to believe that Indigenous people and white people are treated equally in this country. Even Sarkonak admits as much. She goes on to say in her op-ed, white offenders did indeed have a higher acquittal rate, which could be attributed by some to anti-Indigenous racism by the courts. To some. Just to some. But it could also be a result of more white accused persons being taken all the way to trial. If weaker cases against Indigenous people are being habitually dropped, but the same isn't being done for white offenders, you'd likely see relatively more white acquittals. Indeed, federal prosecution guidelines instruct Crowns to consider Indigenous identity and the impact of systematic racism in deciding whether to drop charges. So, Jamie, you agree, but then you disagree. Well, such is the complicated and opaque work of a billionaire-paid propagandist. And, as always, you seem to be hopped up on denialism juice. Take these lines at the end of the op-ed, for example. There are still plenty of unknowns in the data, but what is certain is that we don't have definitive proof of a systematically racist justice system. Amazing. Liberals will point to the demographics of the prison population as a sign of Canada's sins, but any further perusal of the data shows that the system isn't, in fact, tilted in all the ways against Indigenous people. Incredible! This really is propaganda at its most pure form. It is the propaganda of willful ignorance and entrenched colonial racism. Jamie Sarkonak, you are a racist. Uneducated and incurious people like Jamie Sarkonak can deny reality as much as they want. Do it all you want. But denialism can't disappear the truth. Instead of vomiting up racist propaganda on behalf of her U.S. hedge fund billionaire boss, Chatham Asset Management, which owns Postmedia, Jamie Sarkonak should consider doing some basic research. So let's see if we can't burst Sarkonak's bigoted bubble, shall we? In the spirit of solidarity from one scribe to another, I'm here to school Jamie Sarkonak a little bit by reading an excerpt from Policing Indigenous Movements, Dissent and the Security State by Andrew Crosby and Jeffrey Monaghan. These are two people, white people I think, who have actually done the research, who can actually say with certainty what is actually going on in this country. And here's a hint. It's not equality of the races as propagandists like Jamie Sarkonak wants us to believe. Let's find out. Come on, Jamie, let's go. To properly contextualize the policing of Indigenous movements, our analysis starts with an emphasis that Canada has never been decolonized, and it cannot be regarded as a post-colonial society. In Canada, the notion that 1867 marks a new national beginning of a post-colonial society following quasi-independence from British rule serves as the source of a deeply held belief that Canada is free from the burden of colonial history. Evoking what Sunera Tobani calls exaltations of Canadian values, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau echoed this belief when he told a New York audience that Canada was without some of the baggage of colonial pasts or perceptions of American imperialism. Similarly, former Prime Minister Stephen Harper claimed, again to an international audience, that Canada had no history of colonialism. These exaltations recirculate the notion that Canada is a post-colonial society by reaffirming the commonplace belief that colonialism is a thing of the past. There is a strong repertoire of Indigenous histories, scholars, and activist interventions that confront these popular myths of Canadian post-coloniality. Our work is indebted to these efforts at confronting Canadian expressions of post-colonialism, and we focus on how contemporary policing and surveillance are integral components in the maintenance of settler colonialism. A critique of the security state is especially relevant on two accounts. First, because of the popular historical imaginary of what Constance Backhouse has called Canada's mythology of racelessness, or what Eva McKee calls the benevolent Mountie myth, or what Jeff Benvenuto, Andrew Wolford, and Alexander Laban Hinton refer to as the Canadian myth of peaceful colonization. Popularized mythologies of Canadian colonialism, and especially the role of the Northwest Mounted Police, have generally relied upon smug contrasting with the brutality of U.S. Indian policies to valorize a more humane history of colonialism. These hagiographies are especially potent in the histories of the Northwest Mounted Police, later the RCMP, as well as the Indian Affairs bureaucracies that aimed to civilize Indigenous populations. Critical retellings of these dominant histories have been recently popularized thanks to the activism surrounding residential school practices. Yet historical beliefs that Canadian Indian policy was one of benevolence, and assistance still persist. Claiming to assist with crime, poverty, or development remain dominant techniques used by contemporary colonial agencies to justify targeting Indigenous movements. We highlight continuities in these logistics that animate police activities against Indigenous peoples, a key aspect of our settler colonial present. The policing and surveillance practices that we detail are pervasive and have become highly normalized. Mass accumulation of intelligence and cataloging of data within police and security data banks, and the sharing of this information with policing agencies and industry has become an integral yet routine and mundane function of the daily work of the security state. These practices are highly acute when directed against Indigenous movements, and little, if any, oversight exists. Meanwhile, complaint systems are virtually non-existent or ineffective. As an aggregate, the security state has become a large network of bureaucracies with vast mandates and resources who engage in the widespread monitoring and policing of Indigenous populations, as settler colonial an enterprise as there ever has been. Contemporary policing institutions have extended the history of settler colonial law enforcement within the context of the War on Terror. To illustrate the scope of contemporary policing, we use the term security state to capture the broad array of institutions engaged in settler colonial policing. Illustrating the integrated character of settler colonial governance, we show how many non-policing entities are engaged to maintain and do the work of security governance. While the convergence of multiple agencies under the banner of security does not exclusively impact Indigenous communities, there is a long history of controlling Indigenous communities through multiple arms of state agencies, often grounded in efforts to provide security, development, rights, or other impositions of colonial authority. Given the history of settler assertions of security, the contemporary politics of the War on Terror presents another layer in the use of security as a mechanism for policing Indigenous communities. What is novel in the current policing of Indigenous movements is the infusion of national security resources and the dramatic extension of intelligence-led surveillance practices. We use the term security state to capture the current character of policing, which is comprised of what police agencies call integrated approaches that institutionalize the ways in which multiple agencies work collaboratively to preempt security threats. Called the fusion center approach to security, this includes public agencies as well as private corporations, and also refers to traditional policing and security agencies as well as social control agencies like Indian Affairs. Given the emphasis on pre-exemptive policing, the security state is also networked through surveillance. Surveillance information on activists can be stored in a myriad of data banks, which can be shared, recontextualized, and recirculated by numerous actors within the security state. These practices of widespread surveillance on social movements have been completely normalized among actors of the security state because of the centrality of protecting economic interests against supposed national security threats. Where have we heard that before? Scholars have detailed the exceptionalism that has characterized the surveillance of Indigenous peoples in Canada. Keith Smith has argued how Indian reserves have represented a system of segregation and surveillance that is unparalleled in the British Empire, with the possible exception of South Africa. Focusing on the settlement of the prairies, he details the expansive network of surveillance coordinated by Indian Affairs and the Northwest Mounted Police. These settler colonialists engaged in systematic observation, measurement, classification, and judgment of every aspect of Indigenous life, far exceeding any aggregate of information in publicized census data. Smith details the massive tabular reports created through this surveillance and how these practices produced representations of indigeneity and post-colonial whiteness, ensuring that the slightest deficiency, aberration, or stubborn endurance of Indianness was singled out for further corrective action. Smith writes, "What appeared as the Indian was a collage of images that were often contradictory, but always inferior to Anglo-Canadians. The Indian was not merely fantasy, though, but an enduring political, economic, and social instrument. It was a device that bolstered the colonizers' images of themselves as benevolently superior, while at the same time ensuring the advancement of their material interests." The historical framing of Indigenous inferiority juxtaposed with white settler superiority justified ongoing regimes of intervention and corrective measures under liberal notions of development. As a technology of rule, liberalism promotes notions of equality and inclusion, yet practices of settler colonialism have mobilized liberalism as an exclusionary force based on racialized hierarchies of progress and civilization. The extensiveness of the surveillance projects targeting Indigenous populations has served as the primary means of detecting and intervening in expressions of Indigenous autonomy or nonconformity with the settler colonial project. Now that last line is so good, I actually want to read it again. The extensiveness of the surveillance projects targeting Indigenous populations has served as the primary means of detecting and intervening in expressions of Indigenous autonomy or non-conformity with the settler colonial project. Now, this information and the ideas about Indigenous surveillance and the persistent use of police and courts to surveil and control and dominate Indigenous populations in Canada was nowhere in Jamie Sarkonak's Postmedia Propaganda hit piece. But we shouldn't be surprised, shall we? Anyhow, thank you very much for watching this video. If you were moved by it, please hit like. It helps a lot for a small channel like this. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and please leave a comment if you so wish. I'm going to continue with these videos. I have more to say about Jamie Sarkonak's just absolutely vicious and vile propaganda. And frankly, these videos are fun to make, so I hope they're fun to watch, and I hope you'll check us out in another video. Ciao for now.